Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje nós estamos aqui, né, com a presença do professor Arngrímur Vídalín Stefánsson, da Universidade da Islândia. É um prazer enorme recebê-lo. Ele tem trabalhos fantásticos na área de traduções de sagas e também trabalhos relacionados à perspectiva da Islândia, também na era viking. Então, a gente vai passar aqui a palavra para ele e vamos começar sobre essa conversa, que também é um tema muito interessante, principalmente porque a Islândia teve essa repercussão com esse contato também com esses manuscritos, com essa disponibilidade da escrita, né, para falar de alguma dessas histórias. Então, vai ser um tema bastante interessante da gente também analisar aqui no canal, como já foi analisado com outros professores, mas o professor tenho certeza que vai trazer uma contribuição também muito boa aqui para o canal. Professor, thank you so much for accepting the invitation for be here in the channel. It's a big pleasure seeing you. Your work, how that I say it, it's fantastic. Yeah, we have a lot of sagas that your traditions are very grateful to comprehend and understand about more the Iceland in the period of the Viking Age. So this to start our interview, how did you start your interest for this area of to research about the Viking Age and the sagas? How you start your interest for these topics?
Well, thank you for having me. I guess I've always been interested. I remember when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. I made something like a fan fiction, my own Icelandic saga as a comic. And of course, I hadn't read any saga by then. I had only read about them. So I was mixing characters that never actually met and lived in different eras. And I was really fascinated by all that at an early age. And I remember when I was in the 10th grade, that's the usual age when school children or teenagers are made to read their first saga. And I was the only one, if I recall, who was excited about reading Gísla saga. And now, decades later, I'm teaching sagas, Gísla saga among them, a saga that I still find fascinating and in so many different respects. Actually, I did my bachelor's thesis was on modern literature, and I don't think I ever really intended to go anywhere after the BA. And then in 2009, I saw this advertisement for a summer school at the Aarhus University in Denmark. And it was about mythology and narrative spaces, if I remember correctly. And I thought that was really interesting. And I also wanted to try a university abroad, figuring that, they probably wouldn't want me anyway. So I applied and got in, and I got really hooked on the Middle Ages, and I've been there ever since.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. You start doing histories about creative fictional histories about the inspired by the sagas, and start your journey in this area. That's very, very interesting type of to beginning to start to study about that. And it's interesting to saw that sagas have many aspects of the Old Norse language and are very connected by Icelandic perspectives.
Mhm.
And one of the most interesting thing is that I was in a little about doubt is the women have some participation in the perspectives of create sagas too as the men's, like to create texts in the time of the 10th century to 11th and 12th century. How these perspectives are created by the Icelandics, the texts?
You mean gendered perspectives?
Yes, for creating the texts in the by the sagas.
But that's a really good question, because the premise of the answer is something that I don't really know. Whether the texts are mainly written by men, or if maybe many of them, without us knowing, might be written by women. We know at least that in monasteries in Europe, we have both women and men writing texts. And it so happens that the very few texts that we have, that we know exactly who wrote, at least either because they actually wrote their name in the manuscript, like in the case of one of my favorite manuscripts, which is an encyclopedic work from the end of the 14th century. The guy who wrote the thing, he wrote his name in, and also the name of his collaborator, so we know. And then we have, through argumentation, figured out that it is likely that this or other person might have authored some sagas. And these all happen to be men. But overall, I'm not sure, really. I mean, whether the majority of texts really were written by men, I have no idea. And I am not sure either. It's a bit outside of my area of expertise, but maybe we could try to read, gendered perspectives in the texts to try to argue, whether the author might have at least a more female insight, I think it's highly likely that many of the texts that we know and love were written by women.
Oh, that's very interesting. I was very curious about that because we saw that we have many perspectives in the sagas by the genders of men's and women's working in the history, but was very interesting to know how this have this impact of in some writers in that time, and that's very interesting, the point that you know. And one of the most interesting things in the saga is the perspective of the travels. Travels are one of the most topic covered in the sagas, and how we can say that these travels are really made, or we say, oh no, this is only a thing that was imagined for that saga, and how this is impact the perspectives about the Viking Age in this area, how the travels are really, really impacted in the sagas.
That's another really excellent question. We have, as you say, we have many narratives about the travels of Scandinavians and Icelanders. I guess I'll just, for simplification, just call all of them Scandinavians, to avoid the Viking term. And so we have narratives of different kinds. We have, for instance, two sagas that speak of the historical expeditions from Greenland to North America. And of course, we also have other narratives about travels to Greenland and faraway places that are more, they seem more imaginary or novelistic. And then we have stories about the travels of Scandinavians to the east. And some of these are really spiritual. So we have the stories of Eiríkur, the far-traveled, who had the mission to try to find the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, and he does come as close to finding it as is humanly possible, before later becoming sanctified for his pilgrimage. And we also have another story about Ingvar, who is a historical person. And according to the saga, he could not attain kingship in his home country of Sweden. And so he set off to the east to try to find a place where he could make something of himself. And this also turns into a kind of a pilgrimage to try to find the origins of a mighty river, which kind of sounds like he's after the earthly paradise as well. And it's highly likely that this person existed and did travel. And we have some contemporary runes carved into a stone in Sweden. The narrative, of course, is highly ahistorical in many respects. It has something that resembles succubi and other monsters. There's a dragon with magical abilities to kill people, and there is a giant, and many other things. But along his way, we encounter real places and real people. We can definitely pinpoint on a map where some of the cities that he visits are. And we do know, we do have physical evidence of travels made by Scandinavians, both in North America, in Eastern Europe, and so it seems I would argue that many of the narratives, they contain at least a grain of truth about how far people did travel from the far north, both to the east and the west. And then these texts are later, of course, the texts are young. They are not from the time of when the people themselves lived. They are like 300, 400, 500 years younger. And so they are imbued with ideological perspectives, theological, also learned ideas about how the world should look like. And it's obvious that many of these sagas, and also other texts, we have more learned texts like geographical treatises and such. So we can see the thread between learned thinking in Europe on the other hand, and towards the sagas on the other. So so we find these ancient and well-received ideas of what the world looks like, what kind of people you would encounter in different parts of the world. And this is all put into sagas that quite possibly are about real people and their actual travels. So it's just imagine if in the future, like, I don't know, 400 years from now, somebody writes a saga about your own travels and all the monsters that you met when you were traveling somewhere. It's kind of interesting that way, that real people, real travels, but the sagas themselves do not contain any actual details of their travels.
Yes, that's very, very interesting, because we saw that many of these places are possible. We go and visit, and we have I think a website that show all the places. I think it's a project called Saga. I don't remember the name really well, but I think the name is that, and we can saw a map with many of the places of the saga is here in this place of Iceland, and we other saga is in south of Iceland, and we can go to all this place to recreate or visit some of this place. And that was the point of my next question, is how the impact of the sagas in the life of the Icelanders in nowadays, because we know that some sagas, example the sagas of the Icelanders, are a type of the saga that persons can how can I say, research about the orange of the families. And that's very, very interesting point, because how is possible we have this possibility with the sagas to research about our families or about our generations. And that's what is the impact of that in the Icelanders nowadays.
Well, it's I mean, there are many interesting aspects about how we what the reception of the sagas is nowadays, because first off, we torture, I'd like to say, teenagers to read them at school, and they hate them. They absolutely hate them, most students. And then they grow up, and then they think, when they're in their 30s, like, oh, this is our national heritage, and I kind of, you know, I kind of like this stuff, but I will never read it ever again, you know? And then we all have this, or most of us at least, have an access to this website that is quite famous. It's been incorrectly described on the internet as an app that allows you to trace your relations to anyone in Iceland. So that, for instance, if you meet somebody at the bar and you like to, go home with them, first you go to your phone and you check whether you're related. It's not exactly like that, but we do have a website that is capable of this, because there are so few of us. And the thing is that in this on this website, you can trace your lineage back as far as written sources go. And there's a really interesting problem with this the farther back you go, because I mean, yes, I used this as an example once, that I once traced myself back to Ari the Learned, who wrote the Book of Icelanders, and the website is actually called that as well. It's named after the book, so it's called Íslendingabók. And then, yes, sure enough, I found how I was related to Ari, and then I looked what the source of this relation was, and the source was said to be the Book of Settlements, Landnámabók. So that's a medieval text. We have 3 main variations of this text in different manuscripts, and each version of this text is highly politicized in different ways. They're all written by different people with different agendas, and the genealogies in these books, they don't match. And so this is the source for how I am related to some medieval people, a particular version of a text that exists in different versions that would show me some different relationship to other people. So it's, we find that it's highly problematic. But we still do it, and we still claim, I am descended from this and that, saga person. And just as, to humor myself, there is in one particular manuscript of the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, a genealogy of Snorri, where he traces his ancestry back to Adam and Eve, all the way to the origin, the first people. And then I used the website to trace myself to Snorri, and then I just copy pasted his genealogy in front of mine, and then I can claim my descendancy from Adam and Eve directly, just for fun. But yes, we all, in general, people are not aware of the problems of the manuscript preservation and how they contain conflicting information. So in general, Icelanders will say, yes, I am descended from Egill Skallagrímsson, and they will be very proud of that.
Oh, that's very a little bit interesting, because we saw many aspects that persons when read the Iceland Gamma book say, I'm descended from a king or from a person that was a Viking, or many aspects. And is interesting because we don't know how much this really can be correct or can be incorrect. If we sometimes we can saw the two sides of that and say, oh, probably is a descendant of person that was a high status or a low status, and depend of the some comprehension. And you say that a very interesting thing about that, because many persons research about that, but sometimes we can be in some trap in this aspect, because we don't know how this can be work in totally aspects of the life of the Icelanders.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most curiosity thing about this is the influences of some aspects of the Christianity
Mm-hmm.
in this context. Many persons that read the sagas read and say, "Oh, this is exactly like the Viking Age was."
Mm-hmm.
But we saw that not totally of the stories have some basis of the Viking Age, because there are writers in a time that the Viking Age wasn't close to the end. And it's an impact of that is how we can describe that a saga can be really a part of the Viking Age, and part this are fictional created by Christianity in the Iceland.
Yeah, well, of course, there is the problem that if we talk about the Viking Age as it was defined originally, so that it ends by 1066, we have absolutely no manuscripts existing from that early time. We do have some contemporary sagas that are from the 13th century, and that's kind of interesting. So we know who the author is. We know that he went to the court of the Norwegian king, who was kind of, he asked him to write his saga, and the king was probably overseeing that he was be written, written about in a flattering light. and when we compare those sagas to other sagas that are about events that happened a long time ago, we could try to compare, see whether there are differences. And many scholars believe that the sagas are really more, they're taking people from the Viking Age, and they're describing their society in something that resembles more the society of the 13th century. So that might be the case. And I, for one, I always analyze the texts themselves as they are, based on the year in which the manuscript is from, rather than the time that we think that the saga was originally written. So, for instance, if I have a version of, say, Njál's saga that is written in the 13th century, I will say that it's a 13th century text, even though scholars might argue that you could date it to an earlier period. So that's kind of my, at least I can safely say this text is exactly written in this formed during this particular time. And so that's what I'll analyze. And I think that we can read sagas in that manner to try to see how they reflect moralities and ideologies of their writing time, what the I shan't say authors, but the writers of the sagas, what kind of messages they wanted to convey to their contemporaries. So so that's kind of my angle, and so that's what I do, and I think it's a safe bet, at least. But of course, there are different opinions on how we can approach sagas, and I mean, Grettis saga is maybe one of the best examples, because it's the oldest complete versions of Grettis saga are preserved from around 1400, so straddling the 14th and 15th centuries. But many scholars have read it as a far older saga than that, and so it kind of just depends on methodologies and yeah. But I think definitely you're much rather reading contemporary ideas about the Viking Age rather than actual Viking Age. It's probably not all that much like the Viking Age itself, unless things have not changed all that much in a few hundred years.
That's a great point, because we saw that sometimes sometimes it's a mistake, or sometimes can be right, but we take some, how can I say, some pieces of the sagas and interpret for like this is occurred in the Viking Age. Sometimes we can, so that I can take a piece of a saga and say, oh, this is like the Viking Age. They do this or they do that, and I think we can take a little careful about that, because sometimes this not occur in the Viking Age, but the author can put this that he saw and say, oh, this is was doing in the Viking Age. And that was the most difficult thing, because the sagas was one of the documents that we most use for describe the Viking Age. Say the sagas define the Viking Age sometimes. And what's the problem do you see in this type of use of the sagas? What this is can difficult to comprehend the Viking Age when you use the sagas to describe all that period?
Well, it sort of depends on the text itself. Many historians, they would, for instance, use sagas of kings to. I mean, if they probably don't have many other sources to work with, so they will say in this text, let's say Morkinskinna, we have this account of this particular king, and so that becomes a kind of basis of historical research, and then they might have sources from Britain and other places, and try to come close to some kind of historical truth. And I mean, and that's okay, but you always just have to be mindful that the sources you're working with are they are younger, and so we might come to wrong conclusions about some details sometimes. But on the other hand, it's also likely that medieval historians who were writing about Scandinavian kings, they believed themselves to be writing the truth, and they were basing it on oral narratives and perhaps texts that they thought were reliable. So they're not trying to make anything up. But of course, the medieval relationship with the concept of historical research is quite different from ours. And so we'll find historical texts from the Middle Ages that are quite exaggerated, sometimes fabricated. And this is just something that historians and also us who deal with literature primarily have to be mindful of. So, of course, it is possible, and we should use the text to try to, figure out and write about, the Viking Age. Definitely, it's just it's a difficult thing, and that's why we need highly educated specialists in the field to do that.
That's I think you take a good part about that, because it's a thing that we question ourselves about that, because is difficult sometimes we distinguish what is the correct about Viking, that saga say, oh, this is correct about that, and no, this was put in like a fictional moment, and that was, I think, was the part of the most difficult to interpret the sagas and to comprehend the Viking Age. But
and for this reason, many of the scholars of the early 20th century, they thought, for instance, that the sagas of Icelanders were, for the most part, realistic and described real events. But then they would point to things that obviously couldn't have happened, like, here's a ghost, and we know that ghosts are impossible, so we can just cut this bit out. And here's a monster, we could just cut that out. And then you'll be left with the real stories of the real things that actually happened. Of course, this is not the right approach at all, because then you're just cutting out pieces of actual literature that are meant to be there. But they were right in the way that, yes, you can use the texts to figure out historical truths, but it's a difficult venture to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one aspect that was showing me just attention about the aspects of Iceland is that Iceland is the country that initiates that aspects of the texts to begin to, how can I say, put the oral traditions to the right traditions. And the most curious thing is why is the Iceland don't have a lot of rune stones if the traditions of the writing was too strong in the Iceland? It was one of the most thing that I was really curious about that.
Yeah, I have never thought about this. From what I know, most rune stones are erected in someone's memory or in someone's praise, either kings or perhaps someone like just lamenting their son. And I suppose that at least with regard to royal runestones, that maybe Icelanders were a bit too far removed from that kind of culture at the time to erect runestones. But yeah, I don't know why we haven't found any. Maybe we just haven't found them yet. Maybe we do have some, but we have no texts describing the making of such stones in Iceland, and the only objects that we have found, or that the archaeologists have found, that have runes on them are household items like spoons and combs and such. and just basically just saying Guðrún owns this spoon, you know. And then we have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 manuscripts written in runes, which was uncommon. So yeah, this is it's a good question. I guess it's the answer, at least as far as I'm concerned, will remain a mystery. Maybe runologists would know more. Makes me think about Maya Beckwell, who's a doctor of runology. She might know.
That's a very good point about that, because it's difficult to comprehend that, because we saw that have a lot of rune stones in the principal countries of the Viking, like Denmark or Sweden, and we saw that Iceland don't have a lot of the rune stones, but they have a great and strong tradition of the writing, and that was a very interesting point to think. Why don't have a lot if we have this strong part of the writing, and to comprehend the styles and the mythology, and that's very interesting to
There's
think.
one thing that comes to mind is that maybe this is also related to masonry. So maybe definitely in Scandinavia there was more traditions of masonry and building churches from stone and such, whereas in Iceland we don't have that at all. So maybe that's part of the reason that Icelanders just didn't work so much with stone as a material.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you have a work that was very, very interesting, that you discuss about racism in Old Norse literature, and that's shown me some attention about that, because I was very, very curious about that, because you see some terms like blamen and some aspects of our word called bloodmud. And what it is about, how you can say these aspects in the Old Norse literature, that was aspects that describe the racism is connected to these traditions in literature. It was very, very interesting work. I read and think, wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is still ongoing research. I'm working on a book about Blauman in particular. It's a really interesting word in itself. It could be translated quite literally as either blue or a dark man, and it's quite clear from the oldest iterations of this word that we have that it's a direct translation. The oldest texts that contain the word are translated hagiographies, and in the Latin original text, they talk about Ethiopians, but in the meaning devil. So it's really interesting that we have, for instance, a story about Saint Mary, and then a demon pops up, and he's called an Ethiopian. And then in the Icelandic translation, we have the word Blaumother being used. So we have a direct sort of correspondence there. So the dark man is presumably connected to North Africa, and the demonic. And then as we get more and more text gradually, we see the birth of the Icelandic saga, and there we also find Blaumen. And now they are quite different. They are not only demonic anymore. They become so much more. They become more troll-like sometimes. They sometimes they're just, basically Muslims. At other times, they are some kind of less than human monsters that are used as a kind of narrative tool to show how mighty the protagonist is. And these characters, they pop up in so many different texts and many different kinds of texts. They also show up in geographical texts concerning Africa, and I collected all the examples of this word and its use that I could find, and I have a whole binder full of examples. And so my main conclusion by looking at all of these in context is that these texts are describing something that we could call proto-racism. Racism as a concept only comes into being with the advent of the idea of race as a taxonomical concept, of the different types of humans. And this is an 18th, 19th century invention, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that people couldn't possibly be racist before that. They just did it on different terms. And they were basing their ideas on skin tone, on culture, religion, language, even diets, and many other things. And so you can see how they, Icelanders, the ones who wrote these literary texts, they are taking something that they only know about from European texts written in Latin, Black people and other people from different parts of the world, and they read in these Latin texts that these are monstrous people, and they take that, they go with it, adapt it to Icelandic literature, and there it is. Proto-racist descriptions of people from outside of Europe, and it's just fascinating to me. And so it's something that I've been exploring now for many years and will continue to do. And I'm not sure if I'll ever reach any kind of bottom to this investigation. But yeah, it's most certainly, I mean, of all my work, this is what has gathered the most attention. And I mean, of course, it's interesting. It hasn't been done before in the Old Norse world. Of course, it's been it's a growing field of research in studies of centuries past in general. So we have many wonderful scholars who have been working on racism in classical antiquity, for instance, and racism in the Middle Ages, and I think the seminal work on medieval racism currently would be Geraldine Hang's The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages, which is a phone book of a work. It's immense and a must read for any medievalist, I'd say.
Yes, it's a very interesting work. I was, how can I say, I don't see nothing like that, because I was really curious about this topic, because I was not have to see how many works about this specific topic, and for me, give me attention to say, oh, this is a very interesting perspective, because sometimes we only saw perspective of family, perspective of gender, but sometimes it's difficult to discuss racial perspective in that type of text. And it's a very, very a good research. Continue doing, because It's fantastic, this topic. And one of the most curious thing that we started to talk in the beginning of the our interview is the about the gender. And one of the aspects that have in the gender of in Iceland sagas is the participation of women in some many aspects of the characters that are created by in the sagas. And one of the aspects like war women or women that was lovers of other men, and it's aspect of the motherhood in these women, the aspect of being a mother in take care of the child. And what do you consider these aspects of the woman being not only the characters that were considered strong or only the character that's provide the home, but the aspect of motherhood in the sagas? What's the sagas can be show us this aspect of work is like we have the Eivor saga that she was a woman that was a fighter, but in the end decided to be a woman of the home. And what do you see that this aspect in the saga this was described?
Well, it seems to be a cultural thing in many places around the world that um, that traditional roles are highly gendered. Women are often thought to be caretakers of the home and children, and men are supposed to go out to work and fight and things like that. At the same time, many societies seem to allow for women to take on a masculine role if they denounce their femininity at the same time. So that they, in essence, become manly or whatever in order to carry out manly deeds. And then, but you have to choose. And then in the end, Herber decides, to go back to the traditional role. And I mean, we do have real historical examples of whole cultures like this, of women who choose, for instance, not to get married and instead cut their hair and become hermits living like men. And this might reflect, narratives like this might reflect the status of women in medieval Iceland, and that they were, I mean, one other example, which is different though, is from Gisla Saga, where first you have Thordís, a sister of Gisli, who is married, and then her husband is killed by her brother, and she has to avenge her husband, and so she tells on her brother, and then her brother is killed, and then she has to avenge her brother, but now she doesn't have anyone to do that, so she attempts to kill the man responsible herself, but fails. And I mean, yeah, I mean, we don't have much historical data to work with. We only have these narratives. But this is kind of similar to the status of women in 19th century Iceland. They were not allowed to own property. So if a woman was widowed, she would have to remarry or lose her property. Or if she had a son, the son would take over the property. And this was only changed by legislation in the early 20th century, at the same time that women were granted the right to vote. And without me knowing for sure, this might be somewhat indicative of the status of women in medieval Iceland. But yeah, we do have these handful of sort of powerful narratives of women who just take control over their own lives, become heroes in their own right. And I can't really speak to the historical basis, but of course it makes for tremendous literature. And I think Leszek Gardewa, the Polish archaeologist, has been writing a lot about his interpretations of graves here and there. So at least he is the go-to guy to talk to about female Viking warriors. That's kind of his thing now. So he believes that it has a basis in fact that women would be warriors as well.
Yeah, it's you describe perfectly this type of history, because we saw that many aspects are shown in the sagas, and one of the aspects that I think the most contemplate is the part of the motherhood and the part of a warrior woman, and is very interesting. And people nowadays are very interesting in this topic, because it's a subject that was in the media nowadays, and people are very excited about that. And it's I think it is very interesting when we saw that a woman have to assume many aspects of the traditions of that time. It is I think it is a woman that have a more complexity. If we compared in other literatures, we saw a woman that have many phases and phases about that, and this is a character that was, well, I think, in my opinion, one of the most um, challenges to us to analyze, because of that many aspects of one person have all these aspects in their life. And one of the most things that I saw in the sagas is the part we can saw that you say about the supernatural and the paranormal things that occur in the sagas. How do you describe, in your opinion, that these events occurred in the sagas? How this was showed in many aspects of the texts that show, oh, this have a ghost, this have a ritual, this man transform in yourself in a beast. Many aspects of he say, oh, he is a berserk or a hoof Edna, and he's transforming into this type of man that was in a moment of how can I say, he lost his conscience. How do you describe these creatures present? Sometimes elves. How do this is we can be analyzed the paranormal part of the sagas?
Well, I think that people definitely considered these things to be real, and whether or not they're describing real experiences, they are at least describing real beliefs. And I think maybe the most sort of tangible evidence of that would be, I mean, it's something that could be written tons about. It how the revenants are dealt with in Iceland, the afturgöngur, or so you if somebody dies under bad circumstances or conspicuous circumstances, there is fear that they may turn evil in the afterlife, come after you. So Egill Skallagrímsson, for instance, he he refuses to return money to his father that is rightfully his, and then his father dies, sitting in his chair, looking menacingly. And of course, this is bad, and you would want to prevent your really angry father from returning from the dead. So they bury him far away from the farm. And after having first made a hole in the wall of the farm and dragged him backwards out of through the hole, having closed his eyes as well, so that he can't kill you with the evil eye. And then they brick up the wall again. So there's no way he can re-enter the farm, because the ghost can only enter through the doorway that he passed through before. And more extreme examples have people cutting off the head of the corpse and then placing the head with the eyes inwards towards the anus. And there's a wonderful scene in The Northman, the movie, where the hero of the story battles with a Mount Dweller and cuts off his head and does this to him. Exactly how they would have done in the sagas, and interestingly, exactly how people dealt with vampires in Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. You will find vampire graves, so-called, many places where they have done the same. And we still, to this day, at least in Icelandic churches, I don't know if this is something that is more international, but maybe you could tell me how it is like in Brazil, that during a funeral, the casket is turned in a way so that the deceased can see the congregation, the mourners. And then before carrying the casket out, it is turned around so that the deceased cannot see the door through which he is taken. And so we still have this revenant precaution in modern day Icelandic funerals, with the added twist that the undertakers and the priests and the mourners, they don't know that this is the case. They don't know that they are doing it, you know. And so these are real precautions. People are actually doing these extreme things to prevent somebody from returning. And it's also apparent from the texts themselves that those who do return from the dead, they really aren't the person anymore. They are that person's worst qualities and then amplified so that they are even worse than before. So there's something inexplicably evil that just takes hold over their bodies and animates them. And this is partly why they are so important to the sagas, and why early 20th century academics were wrong in thinking that these parts of the sagas were unbelievable. These are things that people actually believed in. Whether or not the actual revenants did come back, you know, like Glaumur and Grettis saga, that doesn't matter. People believed that they did, and they told stories about it, and they wrote them down. People still believe in these things, and it's no surprise. I mean, most people fear death, and whether or not we have religious beliefs, we don't know exactly what awaits us at the other end. And so this is a manifestation of that fear. And also, I mean, what is more horrifying than something that looks human and isn't? And so there are many stories about what can happen to people who do things outside of the boundaries of Christianity. There's this young couple in the West Fjords, near where present-day Holmavik is, and they were taking their little daughter to the church to be baptized. On their way, they stop at a rock and decide to have sex right there and then. And then when they're finished and they look at their little girl, she has become quite grim looking and evil looking, and they freak out and they just leave her there. And then the daughter, of course, becomes something else, and she starts haunting the place as a woman with the head of a seal. And there is a story about an Icelandic bishop who had to exorcise this demon, and we still have the stone called Selkollusteinn right there where she was reported to have been. And so these are both cautionary tales and also just tales that show us proof that evil does exist, and we really need to rely on God and good faith to get us through things. And this is just the ghosts. Then we have the trolls and the other monsters, and I am wholeheartedly of the conviction that people believed in these things and were not writing about them lightly, even though sometimes it can be quite humorous. There's one of my favorite things is where there are two different groups of dead people that have come unexpectedly back home, and there's a group of people who drowned and they are all wet and they are shaking off the water in the living room, and the other group has risen from their graves and they're shaking off the mud and dirt from the grave, and the mud splatters over on the wet corpses and gets stuck on their wet clothes. So you get this visceral, real feeling that this is real, and it is funny. It is actually hilarious, but at the same time, it really is scary. So yeah, maybe one time I'll write a whole book just about walking corpses.
Yeah, you say about a part that I love so much in the Scandinavian countries, the folklore. I think was an amazing histories when you told about the Northman, the scene of the Draugr that he fight. It's very interesting. I was just only think if this is real or this is only in the mind of Amleth in that part. I was in the doubt of that. In your opinion, it's occurred or this fight was occurred only in the mind of the character.
Mm-hmm.
How do you interpret this scene? I question a lot about of many people's, and many people give me many answers different.
But I mean, I imagine it could be both, really. Either or, it works just as well. And definitely, I mean, when I saw this movie, I was amazed because I mean, it's absolutely insane. This movie, it is not like any other movie by the same director. But it's exactly like what a Fornaldar saga, a legendary saga, would look like. It's just, and that is actually possible to put something like that to film. Amazed me. And if this were, of course, this is a medieval text that they're basing on by Saxo Grammaticus. But if this were an Icelandic saga, that mound dweller scene, that would have been real. Definitely not just in the character's mind. But of course, the movie is also in many respects quite different, and there's this hilarious scene at the end that mimics the Lion King, which is another Hamlet version, really, where they are naked fighting in the middle of a volcanic eruption, which is exactly how the Lion King ends, you know. And I was laughing like a lunatic watching it at the same time as I was loving it. So it's a batshit insane movie, but that's what makes it so perfect.
Yeah, it's very very nice perspective that you say about this folklore that was present in aspects of the sagas, these creatures that was described in the sagas, and this is very interesting because it's what I think was of the most part of preserved in this context of the, I think, the paranormal supernatural is this folkloric creatures that were survived of many times, and persons nowadays sometimes believe in some of these, or they can take many advice about, oh, this happened with the church, I don't will repeat the mistake of this person. And this is I think this is a combination of the moral of the time and the aspects of the person say, oh no, we need to have this regret life and don't commit some mistakes. I think they have a lot of this perception of morality in some of these folkloric aspects. And this is interesting that you say. And for our last question, Professor, do you have some sagas that you can advise for persons here in the channel for how I can start to read a saga? How you have some easy sagas, or how saga this is the best? Do you consider? How advices did you have to the audience?
I think I can. There are 3 sagas I'd recommend. First, I'd like to say Laxdæla Saga, mainly because it's the most tragic love story. It's I mean, it really puts Romeo and Juliet to shame. I mean, both are stories about silly teenagers who maybe don't really have their minds about them, but so we have this lady Guðrún. This is really her saga, and she has been married a few times, but all her husbands die, and then she becomes betrothed to this character who is supposed to be the mightiest and smartest and all that stuff. Although I think modern readers will find that person quite obnoxious. He's like the the jock bully type from high school, and he has this not real but still brother type person who they grow up as brothers, and his brother Botley, he's like the second best in everything. And so Kjartan, who seems to be the main hero, he goes abroad and leaves his girlfriend Guðrún behind, betrothed. And then when he finally comes back, far too late, as always happens to saga heroes, his brother has married his girlfriend. And insanity ensues, and so many people die. And it's fantastic. So I highly recommend that one. And also because it's not one of the sagas that is usually recommended. Another one that I always have to recommend is, and that is because it is one of the most amazing sagas about humanity and the supernatural and what delineates the man from a monster. And that is Grettis Saga. And so you have this boy who is abused by his father growing up, and of course he becomes, a juvenile delinquent. He kills another boy quite young, and it's just by luck that he isn't convicted of the murder. And he seems to be absolutely devoid of any talent outside of being really strong. And then he discovers that he has a real good knack for killing monsters. So he destroys a ghost and takes his sword, and that will be his sword after that. And then he starts killing trolls who terrorize people. And then he fights this really famous revenant called Glaumur, who curses him. And then everything that happens after that is a downward spiral for our hero, who himself becomes a monster in the eyes of others. And it's an amazing text. And then thirdly, I want to recommend also, just because we have a movie, it's the only movie that has ever been made after an Icelandic saga. And that is Gísla Saga. And also because it's relatively short and it's easy to comprehend. And at the same time, it's also misinterpreted often. And it's kind of like a worst case scenario in all respects saga. So awful things happen and people die. And then Gisli and his brother and his brother-in-law and his friend, they decide to make a pact to become, blood brothers forever, because they want to prevent further bloodshed in the future. So they're going to make this pact so that. But then all of a sudden, his brother-in-law realizes that he has no relationship to Gisli's friend, Gestir. But so the whole blood brother pact, it doesn't happen. And all of a sudden then, Gestir, Gisli's friend, is found murdered. And Gisli seems to suspect that it is his brother-in-law who did it. But we, the reader, we know that Þorkell, his brother, knew that his wife had the hots for Gestir. So he has the motive to kill him, but Gisli can't suspect his own brother because he can't avenge his friend by killing his brother. And so he kills his brother-in-law. That's the only murder that we know who actually did the crime, because the saga doesn't tell us who killed Gestir. And then everything goes to hell from that point onwards. And it's one of the outlaw sagas where, for most of the saga, Gisli is an outlaw. I can't remember how many years he's just living outside of human society, evading people trying to find him, kill him, and all these different and difficult relationships. They like, as I mentioned earlier, how his sister has to tell everyone that he killed her husband. She just has to. It's a matter of honor. But then when her brother is killed, she has to do something about that as well. And I love this kind of intricacy. It just goes to show that, people never change. Most of these sagas, they are about young, foolish people who do foolish things, and they are in love with the wrong person. And the only difference between this and something like Riverdale or other soap operas is that not as many people die on TV. But in the sagas, usually everybody dies. and I think that's the main sort of difference. Otherwise, it's just humans being human, which means ridiculously silly.
Yeah, that's true. Professor, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was amazing discuss with you about this subject. It's amazing know about much more about the sagas. is one of the most topics that I love to cover here in the channel, because we can explore infinite things in the sagas, have a lot of chapters, a lot of aspects, and this is really amazing. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a joy.
I will just stop the recording.